Çok değerli bir başka hocamız var. New York, Oslo, Salvador ve Viyana ve daha pek çok şehir için uluslararası danışmanlık görevini üstlendi. Bunun yanı sıra pek çok şehirde ve ülkede yönetim reformlarının yapılmasına katkıda bulundu. Ödüllü bir isim, çok değerli bir hoca. Bir sürü etiketi var. Kendisinden rica ettim en doğrusunu söyleyelim diye. GLL Cities Research Center'ın chairman'ı. Urban Land Institute Europe'un Senior Fellow'u, City Leadership Institute'un Chairman ve Profesörü. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Greg Clark. Büyük bir alkış rica ediyorum Profesör.
A pioneering perspective, setting standards. A sense of quality that determines excellence. Architecture with ambitious new lines. A sustainable lifestyle that redefines the fabric of urban living. Authentic, unrivaled concepts at key locations. TechFan Real Estate, ever for the better.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Fatosh, thank you very much for the introduction. Let me send warm greetings to Avi Alkash, to all of the sponsors, the supporters, and the organizers of this fantastic event. I also want to pay tribute to both Peter and Bekir, who spoke before me, who've touched on many of the themes that I hope to talk about as well. And I share, of course, Peter's great love of this city, and what a pleasure it is always to be in Istanbul and to breathe the air from the Bosphorus and to think about this amazing history of this fantastic city. It's an interesting time if you're interested in metropolitan cities and the concept of good growth, which is what I'll be talking about today, because just last week 3 new metropolitan plans were published, and I managed to get myself to New York, Sydney and London all in the space of 1 week as these 3 new metropolitan plans emerged, looking at how these 3 cities will grow and develop over the next 50 years. And of course that builds upon the new Hong Kong 2030 plan, the Tokyo 2050 plan, and Seoul's 2070 plan, all of which I'll be talking about in one way or another over the next few minutes with you. So the idea here is to really talk about the century of the city, the metropolitan century, and to talk about how real estate, land use planning and infrastructure come together with the bigger picture of change that both Peter and Bekir have been discussing with you. Now, I'm lucky to work with lots of different organizations around the world. I won't waste your time giving you an advert for the work I do, but suffice to say that I think the world of real estate encompasses within it so many interesting drivers and catalysts, whether it's technology and the way that changes economies, or whether it's densification and how we can use that to build brand and identity, whether it's metropolitan management and how that affects how cities engage with global spaces, whether it's the interaction between cities and nation states and how that politics is changing, or whether it's really about the DNA of the city, the things that Peter was talking about earlier, and indeed Bekir was talking about, how the city digs deeply into the well of its past to form a narrative, a vision, a story about the future, and uses that as an organizing idea to overcome fragmentation or coordination weaknesses that exist. All of these issues are here with us today. Now, there's many ways of describing the century that we're in. I like to call this the century of cities, the century of urbanization, and my reference point is essentially that from 1980 to 2080, in that 100-year period, humankind is making a great trek back to the cities, a shift of approximately from 20% of the world's population living in cities to 80% of the world's population living in cities over a 100-year period. And this, of course, means that in the developing world, cities are emerging almost from scratch. Villages become towns, towns become cities, cities become megacities. In the developed world, of course, it means metropolitanization, the regionalization of existing cities, their connectivity, their partnership, and their fusing together. And this century is not just a century of urbanization, but it's a century which is synchronized with three other very important drivers. The first one is, of course, the stabilization of the human population levels that we think just below 10 billion by the end of the century. Ubiquitous exponential technologies that are changing the way we work, the way we live, the way we trade, the way we organize, and in particular, the way we manage cities. And then, of course, the climate change emergency that requires us to think about different ways of traveling, different ways of powering, and different ways of organizing our lives. So if you like, we live in this very interesting middle third of this interesting century when urbanization is a shaping dynamic, but where the use of new technologies and the ability to put that together with new trading systems to create new infrastructure platforms allows us to think about a much more radical way of changing the cities that we live in a much changed world where climate and global trade are drivers in ways they haven't been in the past. And many of you are very familiar with what these new technologies are and how they work, how they create a new politics, a new set of social values and norms, new systems of communication, but they also drive urban economies. And you'll hear me talk a lot about the sharing economy, the innovation economy, the new knowledge economy, the circular economy, the experience economy that is so radically changing, for example, urban retail and how that works. And these new technologies, of course, change urban systems and provide opportunities for new kinds of networks and integration that didn't exist before. And of course, these technologies enhance and accelerate new forms of competition, but also new forms of cooperation between cities. And we'll come back to much of that. Now, many of my slides will cover very briefly at the beginning some of the things that Peter talked about with huge expertise concerning, if you like, the cycles of globalization. And for me, thinking about cities and periods of globalization and international development and how those new technologies are the defining technologies of the current cycle reminds me, of course, of the ways that technologies have over history shaped certain epochs along with other kinds of geopolitical changes that have linked to new forms of trading patterns. And each of them has allowed new groups of cities, or waves of cities, as I like to call them, to globalize at the same time. Cities rarely globalize on their own. They come together in new patterns and new formations and begin a new process of trading, or they find again a process of training that they had before. And this is why perhaps being in Istanbul is so interesting, because Peter's remarks about, the changing economic geography of Eurasia is so important in realizing that Istanbul potentially has the opportunity to be the only city, I would guess, in history that has re-globalized or globalized and then re-globalized on 4 occasions in rather different ways due to rather different patterns. And Peter's told you almost everything you need to know about the new Silk Roads, but it occurs to me that the phenomenal nature of the infrastructure connectivity, the new trading expectations, and the way that combines with these new technologies to accelerate patterns of urban change are the most important things, bringing with them huge opportunities, huge scale, but inevitable dilemmas that go with it. Now, with my friends at Jones Lang LaSalle, we've been developing over the last period an attempt at a sophisticated way of looking at the different kinds of cities that emerge in this cycle of globalization. If you like, the simple thesis goes like this, that in the last cycle, from roughly the 1980s up to about 2008, 2009, when the global financial crisis or the Western banking crisis, depending on your preference, came about, we had this idea of a world city that was based on the model that was evolving in New York and London and perhaps Hong Kong. That cities were global cities if they were corporate hubs, if they were centers of finance and professional services, if they had a strong visitor economy and the cultural attributes to go with it, and they projected themselves onto the world as the makers of the rules around capital markets, company formation, the legal systems, the English language, and everything else. So we had this view of the world city from the 80s and the 90s that we all sort of got used to. I think there are all sorts of reasons for thinking that in this cycle, the world is rather different. So since 2010, one simple way of putting this would be to say that we see the emergence of at least 3 different kinds of world cities. Yes, the Londons, the Hong Kongs, the New Yorks, and the Parises, now trying to tackle a whole series of challenges and problems to do with housing markets and infrastructure and segregation and polarization and doing deals with their nation states that are proving to be stubbornly hard to resolve. Yes, in the top right-hand corner, a new set of world cities, the Barcelonas, the San Franciscos, the Tel Avivs, the Cape Towns, the Santiago de Chiles, the technology-rich, smaller, managed metropolises with the high quality of life combining with the talent drivers. And then I think this third group of what we might call the emerging world cities, although all of this language is insufficient in one way or another, which are the big cities that are the junction boxes between the larger economies and the global systems. And of course, we see Istanbul in here very strongly, but it's not a city that's globalizing for the first time. As I've already said, it's globalized at least 3 times before in history. But what's interesting about this way of thinking about these cities is that we can think about Istanbul in relation to Shanghai or Sao Paulo in Mexico City or Guangzhou or Bangalore and think about what are the common threads. And as we analyze these cities and think about the different typographies, the challenges that they face, when we think about this group of cities, it's all about housing supply. It's all about tackling social polarization, the things that Bekir was just talking about. It's about land use and creating metropolitan form. It's about building a business climate that is acceptable both to the small entrepreneurs and to the larger businesses. It's about knowing how much to attract and retain international talent as well as building one's own talent pool. It's certainly something to do with accommodating emerging sectors, building infrastructure systems rather than just infrastructure projects, and it's a lot about creating identity, reputation, and story to differentiate in a new market. So these emerging world cities have a strong set of, if you like, common imperatives amongst them. And when you look at Shanghai, or you look at the achievements of Seoul, or you think about what's happening in Sao Paulo and Mexico City, you can see the same drivers to turn a big city into a city that works for all sorts of audiences and customers and citizens and other kinds of groups, and to build around that a story of distinctiveness that cements that city in a particular set of roles, not just in capital exchange, but in knowledge exchange, in entrepreneurship, visitorship, of course, as well. So as we think about these emerging world cities, we can see, for example, that if we put New York, London, and Tokyo to one side, all of the GDP growth in the major cities in the world over the next period is going to be in these cities, in the emerging world cities. And so it allows us to think, and as you can see, many of them, of course, are Asian cities, but they're not only Asian cities. And there are major real estate implications for all of this. These cities are integrating into the new economy, so the real estate of connectivity is very important, not just infrastructure, but of course, airports, ports, other kinds of logistics platforms. They're huge new centers of demand and supply, not just for housing or retail, but also, of course, for corporate locations and very large service requirements in terms of public facilities. They are new HQ locations, often for companies that are growing very quickly. They're new knowledge centers where the expansion of universities, research, and medical facilities is happening. And some of them are also becoming financial centers, but by no means all of them are. So in this context, I wanted to spend a few minutes reviewing, as it were, where is Istanbul in this map of the emerging world cities in the world at the moment, and how is it performing? And if you like, if we take an outside-in perspective on Istanbul from the plethora of international comparative studies, what do we see? So using the 200 or so benchmark studies, and we've tried very hard to eradicate what I believe is a Western bias in a lot of these studies, and we've used, as far as possible here, the major studies coming from Japan and Korea and China and the Middle East, as well as the ones that emanate in Western Europe and in North America. The first thing we can observe, if you like, is that Istanbul is the 22nd most visible city in the world in terms of these studies. In other words, there's 21 other cities that are compared or highlighted more frequently in these studies. And then there's about 2,000 cities that are less visible than Istanbul. And Istanbul is becoming more visible. You can see here it's more visible than Milan, more visible than Mumbai. Very interesting that Istanbul's presence in these benchmarks and indexes and rankings is really growing. If we talk about business and finance sectors for a minute, there's a sustained story here of good news, despite some wobbles that I'll talk about in a minute. The scale of demand, the growth of the population, the youth of the population, the scale of the current investment program in infrastructure is driving Istanbul to be recognized as a globalizing city with increased capacity. The ability to absorb investment capital is there, and the ability to create new real estate is understood, as well as the ability to diversify and grow the economy. So lots of good news really in this space. When we look at the knowledge economy, what we see is that Istanbul is doing well in terms of the performance of universities, tertiary institutions, and others. But if you like, the first small gap emerges, which is a gap around the processes of entrepreneurship. If you like, not just knowledge, but how to build a knowledge economy from knowledge, and some key challenges to address there. When we look at quality of life, we find very interestingly that the local perceptions of quality of life in Istanbul are better, as it were, than the observed performance through the studies. In other words, people love living in Istanbul, and they learn to put up with certain kinds of things. But in terms of things like healthcare and education, these are the things that are holding Istanbul back from being, as it were, a top 10 emerging world city. And of course, there are off-again, on-again concerns about security and stability, which everyone will understand. However, what's important, I think, to observe in all of this is that many of these are measures of perception rather than measures of reality. And if you like, the concerns about security and sustainability can be, I think, dealt with much better communications. You won't be surprised to hear, of course, that in terms of destination and cultural appeal, Istanbul is ranked incredibly highly. What I think is important here, though, is that as well as that visitor destination message that Istanbul has had for many, many, many years, there's a growing understanding of a business brand here. A business buzz, a new economic dynamism is well understood, and there's an improved measure of cultural interaction. And if you like, the challenge that we have to deal with here is the one of stability and what we might call trust. You can see, of course, Istanbul's rankings here, and I'm quoting here the Japanese study, the Global Power Cities Index, one of the best comparative indexes of cities. You can see Istanbul has improved from 2015 to 2016 by 3 points. There was a dip in 2014, which of course has come back again. Comparative assessments of attitudes towards Istanbul reveal that managers, visitors, and artists have a stronger preference for Istanbul than do researchers and residents over time. So there's something then again for the researchers, the knowledge economy piece of the story, and something for the residents about the quality of life improvements that are going to be needed to sustain, as it were, support for the global city development and story. Of course, nobody in the room will be surprised to see that externalities associated with rapid growth feature very highly in all of these comparative analysis of Istanbul. Chronic congestion is a big part of the story, and the city, of course, is widely considered to have real congestion problems. And there's also these issues of safety and considered a high risk, not just to do with the volatility around earthquakes, but a wider sense of kind of geospatial insecurity and things needing to be done there. But as you'll see in a few minutes, in fact right now, there's a huge progress arriving as a result of growing international awareness of the investment campaign that's underway in infrastructure, which we'll return to right at the end. And that investment process is now being recognized and factored much more into the story about Istanbul and how it's understood. Now, if I try to summarize all of this analysis in two quick charts, I'm going to show you the same chart twice. So firstly, this is Istanbul versus all of the other emerging world cities that are the leaders in the world. We deliberately took the top 20 of those cities and characterized Istanbul against it using our own algorithm. What you can see in terms of the challenges is really three areas. The global reputation of Istanbul has fallen since 2014 and is on the way back, but there needs to be a new effort, I think, in storytelling and image building to help the city accelerate that progress. The second one are these livability aspects: high air pollution, CO2, water use, earthquake, flood risks, reminding people that Istanbul is safe and making it safe. And then the third one is livability, as it were, the low scores for social cohesion, for health, safety, and security. So those are the three challenges, and they very clearly emerge from the comparison. But you have to see those against the four great advantages which have emerged. Firstly, as you can see, visitor and destination power is growing and is perhaps the best of all of these emerging world cities. And you put that next to culture and diversity, where Istanbul again scores top results. And then you can see that transport and infrastructure is really improving. And then very much a city which inspires confidence by global firms in terms of where they want to be and where they need to be. So lots of things going well for Istanbul, and two or three areas where some, as it were, extra attention is needed, and that's all summarized here. Now, is it possible to think that Istanbul could learn anything or benefit from interaction with other cities that are trying to tackle similar kinds of challenges in this kind of fast middle third of this great century of urban and metropolitan growth? And I think it's important to say to any audience in Istanbul that Istanbul is not alone in trying to address these kinds of challenges. When I was in Hong Kong just recently, the same kinds of conversations were happening as are happening here. When Sao Paulo released its strategic plan just a year and a half ago, trying to deal with the same kinds of challenges. And Shanghai, of course, has focused on exactly the same things. So today I really wanted to talk to you about four cities where I think there are some interesting lessons to learn. And we've picked London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Seoul. And partly this is because these cities also share some of the real estate challenges and opportunities that all such fast-growing big cities share. And if I could summarize those, I'd say that the real estate challenges are as follows. Firstly, the changing needs and increasing specialization of customers, leading to very different business models in real estate, and we'll come back to that. The second one is obviously the integration of public and private space that's going on. The third one, of course, is the competition between capital to find the right kinds of projects. And then the third one, of course, is intensive restructuring of urban real estate around the new infrastructure programs that are in place. So if you think about a city like London, with its long-term metropolitan growth plan, the London plan, the city's on the move from 8 to 10 million, the region's on the move from 20 to 25 million. Long-term planning and thinking about how to use infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure, as the underpinning shaper of the city is very much the focus of what's happening there. It's an enabler of density. It enables London to focus on opportunity areas where intensive urban surgery will occur in order to really densify certain locations and to enhance placemaking. And just like Istanbul, there's a metropolitan government and there are local governments, so there are coordination issues that always have to be addressed. London has a very distinctive housing affordability challenge, and that challenge is pernicious and long-term. It will not be solved easily with short-term policies, but a housing strategy is in place that involves speeding up the process of house building, designating public land to be used in certain ways, unlocking very large sites for housing development, and fast-tracking, as it were, planning processes. And a combined infrastructure plan is in place, trying to bring together energy, utilities, waste, water, transport, and wider infrastructures to create a kind of integrated approach to growth management and to growth shaping. London's also using high-speed rail projects as a way to underpin its new growth geography, as it were. In particular, the Crossrail 1 program, the Elizabeth line that will open at the end of 2019, and then Crossrail 2, a different line of going from northeast to southwest that should open in 2033, providing the financing package is agreed. So London's approach is very much to use transportation as the shaping mechanism to undertake urban restructuring, to build a bigger city, a more diverse city, and a city that's less congested and more able to accommodate itself to the needs of specialist firms. Tokyo, on the other hand, has a different kind of problem. Tokyo's problem is not one that's to do with infrastructure. Principally, the historic cycles of investment in infrastructure in Tokyo have been very successful. In Tokyo, the story is really a challenge around innovation, enterprise, productivity, and growth. And so Tokyo's first big project is one around business and enterprise zones, trying to create an environment in which the sorts of reforms that Prime Minister Abe is trying to put forward can actually be experimented with at the local level, creating these zones of enterprise investment, these zones of innovation. That's underpinned by a whole series of processes that are about speeding up land use reform and reuse, trying to use the existing infrastructure to enable land to be more intensively used, shifting, of course, to mixed use, shifting to hyperdensity, shifting towards a better approach to public space at the same time as accommodating all those challenges that come from new technologies, which involve, of course, much smaller private space and much bigger use of public space. That in Tokyo, of course, is combined with support for particular technology sectors, automated vehicles in particular being one of them, self-drive technology, Japan as a leading car manufacturer using the city of Tokyo as a kind of laboratory for the things that it's doing in relation to automated vehicles. In Hong Kong, the challenge is really one not just of accommodating population growth and building new houses, but it's one of regional integration with the southern part of mainland China. And I find this map very interesting because this is really the Hong Kong region, but more than 80% of the landmass that you see is within mainland China. So the program of building the new territories, the new towns, and as it were, the Hong Kong model of urban living being used in areas of mainland China that were not traditionally part of the special administrative region of Hong Kong has been a very important part of the story. And that has been right at the core of developing this idea of the 110 million greater Pearl River Delta, perhaps the biggest economic region in the world now, increasingly integrating through rapid development of infrastructure, transport projects, creating a network of cities and regions to be an economic powerhouse for the future. Now, in Hong Kong, building these new territories as a way of accommodating population growth has led to them really reinventing the idea of the new town. New towns that in a sense emerged in Western Europe and in America in the 50s and 60s as part of the post-war restructuring process has been reinvented in Hong Kong and created a series of towns where culture, services, economy, urban design, connectivity have been a really important part of the equation. And much has been learned in Hong Kong about how to make new towns work, from minimum critical mass to how you create identity, how you build a regional story about a series of locations that are really, in a sense, satellites of a well-known city, Hong Kong, but have to have a rationale of their own. And building that regional story has been the key part of doing that. This approach has also allowed Hong Kong to be much clearer about the specific locations in which certain kinds of industries are going to operate. So this Pearl River Delta has an industrial strategy that has very particular spatial characteristics to it. If you like, the reform and the reallocation of land uses in order to create a city which is efficient. So if you can imagine what this would be like in the Istanbul region, it would be the deliberate relocation of certain industry or logistics or knowledge activities to certain locations in order to benefit from proximity and clustering, and at the same time to allocate land uses more rationally to the places which are best able to support them. Hong Kong has also become a world leader in how to combine infrastructure investment with land use reform and financing, so that land use reform increasingly pays for infrastructure, and infrastructure creates an opportunity in which land redevelopment, property redevelopment can be done. A very positive cycle of continuous reinvestment, rather than a process of, as land use reforms come forward and real estate investors take risks, taxes are levied, and then those taxes are used to pay for all sorts of services, which of course is not an unreasonable thing. This mechanism has captured more of the value in a single financial equation that's enabled investors to proceed with confidence that the investments they make will be used to provide infrastructure that supports the investment and enhances the value of the asset. If we go lastly to Seoul, Seoul's story, of course, is perhaps the least well-told story of any city in the world. This is the only city, over 10 million people, that has gone from being classified, as it were, as part of the third world in terms of average income levels and standards of living and quality of life 50 years ago, to being widely acknowledged now as a world leader, particularly in science, technology, education, medicine, healthcare, and being considered one of the most prosperous and productive cities in the world. One of the ways they've done that is through a relentless focus on science and technology and on the education processes that go with that, and the development of a plan, particularly an infrastructure plan, to underpin that: digitization, fast-speed internet, ubiquitous connectivity, particularly on public transport. Very important part of the Seoul story as being, yes, a megacity, but a smart megacity to boot. The economic strategy of Hong Kong, I think, is worthy of some comments. The clustering of the semiconductor, the super electronic industries in certain locations, very high value-added specialization in ICTs and high-tech, and this digital city project that has, as it were, created the world's first digital innovation city. Here you can see on the picture, trying to create an approach to clustering digital innovation on a scale which will enable Seoul to lead the next generation of discoveries and insights and inventions as they see it. So I can see that my 30 minutes is just about up. So let me come to my last slide. Everybody in the room will know, I think, that the lessons from these 4 other cities are interesting for Istanbul because there's lots of resonances in the challenges that Istanbul faces and the challenges these cities are facing and how they're trying to innovate and drive forward in order to succeed. And I hope the message is clear that Istanbul is not alone and Istanbul is not behind. There isn't some kind of deficit message here where Istanbul has unique challenges that other cities don't face. But I think it shows you that a concerted effort to really address growth challenges, to translate, as it were, growth into good growth is very important. Now, there are many reasons, I think, to be optimistic and positive in Istanbul. One of them, of course, is this amazing current program of infrastructure investment that's underway, which you can see here. And I would expect that the future effects of this will be a huge increase in economic agglomeration as specialized centers emerge and as land use is more rationally allocated and the labor market becomes more productive because of public transport. I think that this shift to public transport will enhance Istanbul's reputation for air quality. It will enhance the reputation for efficiency, for trustworthiness. And the shift towards a more polycentric Istanbul region with different areas of specialization, I think will be very important in terms of making the diversity of the Istanbul economy much more visible. One of the effects of clustering and the creation of specialist zones and districts is that leading edge technologies and companies and entrepreneurs become more visible to the outside world. So using this current infrastructure cycle to shape the metropolitan area is very important. And there are very specific roles, of course, for the real estate community in proactively designing and managing those locations that are really going to be enabled by the infrastructure as it's completed and it comes on stream. But I think it's very important to observe that, if you like, there's another bit to this story. And I think that both Peter and Bekir spoke about this in their remarks in very compelling ways. So I would say that my observation would be that doing all of these hard things well is very important. The infrastructure, the land use, the buildings, the redevelopment, the mixed use, the economic specialization, that's very important. But the thing that's equally important is telling the story of Istanbul to the world in the right way. The brand, the identity, the reputation, and the narrative that, if you like, leverages this very particular DNA that Peter spoke about so brilliantly in his speech. And I think that leads to a recognition that these kinds of very big cities don't succeed on their own just by governments doing the right thing. They succeed by there being a real partnership in the business sector and the civic sector, the citizen sector, if you like, that there is a group of organizations and institutions and citizens that are willing to somehow share the leadership. And particularly in environments where there has been political strife, this is very important in giving a sense of there being another voice that's not just a political voice, that's not in friction with politics, but is operating in the space of telling a different kind of story about a different kind of place. And then I think that the third element of that then is that civic leadership should pay attention to optimizing the quality of place. So in my view, Istanbul has a unique DNA, the only city to be globalizing 4 times in its life. It's a city that has huge powers of reinvention. And the power of reinvention is driven not just by infrastructure, but by ideas and by stories. And it's ideas and stories that not just recruit the citizens, but also recruit the world to this cause. And I'm confident that with a group of people like this in the room, and many, many leaders here in the room, there's an opportunity now for the business community, the civic community, the academic community, to play a very distinctive role in helping the world to see not just that Istanbul is the great city we've always known it to be, but that Istanbul is also a city that's getting decisively better and is a city that has a very bright, bright future. Thank you very much.
presentation. Very optimistic note. We needed that.
Good.
Just a question. You answered it. Who should lead the storytelling of the town?
Well, I think I was trying to say, Tokash, that there is always a role for the mayor and the metropolitan government and the local governments in this. But actually, local governments are not particularly good at storytelling. And the people who should really tell the story would be some kind of team, partnership or alliance of business people, of academics, of cultural icons, performers, artists, writers. These are the people who can really tell the story. And in the really successful cities, the government knows that it has to do some of that, but it also knows it needs to create a space in which civic and artistic and citizen leaders can really act. But governments don't learn this until those partners get organized and say, hey, Mr. Mayor, or hey, Madam Mayor, we want to help with this, and we've got a campaign, an idea, a story, or a proposition. So it's people in this room and their friends who need to tell the story.
We need self-organizing groups to
Yes.
cooperate. Thank you very much.
Not too many groups, one group,
One group
please.
to cooperate.
Yeah, just one.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. Bu harika sunumdan sonra 3 tane küçük anonsum var. Biri, lütfen çıkarken kulaklıkları masaya teslim edelim. Sosyal mecrada hashtagimiz biliyorsunuz RE360 buluşması. Bu sesin, bu harika konuşmaların, buradaki bütün bu optimist mesajların dışarıya gitmesine yardımcı olalım. Afiyet olsun. Yemek dışarıda, fayede ve Bosphorus salonunda. Görüşmek üzere.